Aha. I always love being in front of a microphone. It reminds me of spending the 10 years I did on KMHD, just sitting there late at night playing crazy jazz for people. Hello and welcome back to Great Decisions. It's great to see so many faces that we know and love. I am Tim DeRoche. I'm the Director of Programs for World Oregon. This is my 15th year doing this Michigas, and I'm glad you came along for the ride. It is a very exciting year. It is our 75th anniversary in 2025. Thank you. So things to look forward to in April 30th, and you'll be hearing a lot about this throughout this series. We will be doing our Bridge Together, our big annual fundraiser at the Reiser Center for the Arts. We would love to see your faces as we lift a glass and people help us make sure that for another 75 years we are doing what we do. I do like to remind people that we were founded in a moment very much like one that we are in and about to be in. And it is exciting to know that, as the saying goes, we are the ones we've been waiting for. That programs like this are the things that make Portland the kind of city that we like to be in. And it's such a rich opportunity to program for this community. And Great Decisions is one of the things that we do every year that makes me happy as a clam. So I've got my usual round of announcements. We have books, $35 for you today from Good Family. We make a deal. You walk out with a book. You come ready for the next few events, prepared. Don't worry, there won't be a test. It does not account for your grade, but if you'd like to follow along, it's a good way to do that. The other thing we're doing this year is, I'm not sure how much of this you know, but Great Decisions was founded as a discussion series, self-organizing groups around the community and around the state. At one point in the 50s, we had about 1,200 people involved in Great Decisions discussion groups, which is pretty awesome to think about. One of the most active was in Klamath Falls. Took place in a barn with a guy who was like a ham radio operator, and it had a school janitor and a nurse and some farm workers who got together once a week and learned about such controversial topics as red China and things like that in the 50s. So we are actually going to start a Great Decisions discussion group of our own, which we've done a little bit over the years. And I've got a sign-up sheet that I'm going to put at the table over there where Derek Olson is. And if you would like to sign up, you could. We don't have a time or a date set, so I want to see what kind of critical mass we get for it. I have a few people who have told me that they were very interested. I want to see how many more people come in. One of the things we're doing a lot this year is looking at our origin story. So one of the big pieces of our origin story was small group discussion. And I think that we're all craving connection. I think we're all craving community. I think having reasonable conversations with friends and neighbors about big ideas is something that we can help with. So if you want to do that, this will be at the front desk. And as Neville comes in, I'm talking about the Great Decision Discussion Group. We're waiting on that. What else? I do want to be very grateful. I want to thank some folks today. Great Decisions is made possible in part with the generous support of Leslie Brunker in her mother's honor, with additional support from longtime members David Margulies and Bill and Tina Brown. So thank you for helping keep this flame going. As I've said many, many a time, we've been doing this series since 1953. I have not been here that whole time. Some days it feels like it, but in a good way. Other things we have coming up, we are going back to youth exchange this summer. If you or someone you know would love to host a young leader from across the globe, we are doing a youth exchange program this summer with Algerian teenagers. And this is very similar to the Iraqi youth leadership program that we did for many years. It's going to be July 14th to 26th. We've got flyers for this over on the table. These are amazing programs, life-changing. And some of you have hosted folks in the past. And it is an amazing way to create connections that last far longer and into a future beyond the 10 days that they are here in Portland. So think about it. What else do I have here? If you want to pick one of these up, this is a little bit of background on Great Decisions that sits on the table over there with the books. And it talks a little bit about the origins of Great Decisions. There is also a facsimile of a Western Union telegram that Dwight Eisenhower sent to the Foreign Policy Association when the World Affairs Council of Oregon won the national prize for engagement for this series that you are experiencing here, which not only were we involved with, but PSU, back to Vanport College days, was instrumental in making, part and parcel of the culture of Oregon. Before we get going, I do want to recognize we are in the Native American Student and Community Center here at PSU. This is a lovely space. We haven't been in here for years. We are very grateful we've been able to use the space this time. And so I want to acknowledge that Portland State University is located in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon, in Multnomah County, and we honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on: the Multnomah, the Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important that we acknowledge the ancestors of this place and that we recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants, and we are forever grateful. So today, we are kicking off the series. I am very excited. One of my favorite things is finding new faces and new voices who can help us bring different perspectives to old issues like trade and economics and human rights. And we have with us today Dr. Anna Miramanova. I keep getting the syllables wrong, who joined the economics department at Lewis and Clark in 2023. She holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Oregon, specializes in international economics with a focus on international trade. Her research focuses on impacts of sanctions on international trade at both aggregate and firm levels, trade policy and multilateral trade agreements, and medical trade and health outcomes. And her research has been published in top international economics journals, including the Review of International Economics, the Canadian Journal of Economics, and the World Economy. And I am really excited that she can help us navigate a conversation on what the US's options are as leaders in the world economy going forward, starting next week. So big hand. I do want to remind you, we are streaming this. So when we get to Q&A, your Q&A needs to be on mic. We will be walking around with the mic. I will remind you that a question is 30 seconds or less and has a question mark on the end of it. It does not have a missive. It shouldn't be a comment. And I will take you down if you go there. So, big hand for Professor.
The grand reveal. Hi, everyone. Is this okay? Yeah. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here, a little bit nervous, to be opening this event. But today I will be discussing the first reading, right? And we are kind of thinking about what are the opportunities for the US in this kind of deglobalization period that we are looking at? And I'm a trade economist, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring a lot of data. So that's why I have slides. And I'm going to basically talk about deglobalization, right? Is it actually happening? What patterns in the data do we see? Or are we actually just seeing this neo-mercantilism moment, right? And this is the phrase that I'm taking from the new book that came out from the uh, William Mark Palin about the left-wing vision of the free trade, right? Because right now we are associating the free trade vision mostly with kind of the libertarian right-wing narrative, right? But a lot of it can come from the left-wing vision as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on thinking about deglobalization, hyperglobalization, and then thinking about the rollout, why is it happening, and talk about trade war, right? Because I think it's, very on all top of our minds, and January 20th is coming, and I'm always want to be mindful of that. So deglobalization, as we're seeing currently, right, it's really definitely not a new idea to Trump. Trump kind of took it, capitalized on it a little bit, but the deglobalization narrative has been running around since about 2008, right? Since the moment of the Great Recession, because the Great Recession permeates the US economy, but it also kind of takes root in a lot of other countries. And before Trump, we also see this really big event of Brexit, right? When UK leaves the European integration, it has been a part of it since 1973. So that's a really, really big idea. So Trump takes this sentiment, right, and he really capitalizes on it. So I want to kind of dive a little bit into why we are seeing this deglobalization moment in what we see in research. So first of all, do we actually see that the world is really that the globalization is completely over? We are done with it. Not really, right? Because as economists, we usually look at three things. We look at the movement of trade and services across globe, so that's going to be trade. We look at the movement of people, that's migration, and we look at movement of capital, right? So financial capital, physical capital. So what I want to show you here, right, this is one of my first graphs. The solid blue line is the value of trade in US dollars. And you see that the value of trade is going up, and it has been going up since 1980s, right? But what we do see is that the importance of global trade in the world GDP has been stagnating since about 2008, right? Since about the Great Recession. So we do see that trade maybe, while it's still rising, the importance in GDP is maybe not as important, not growing as much as it used to prior to the Great Recession. What do we see in terms of the capital investment, right? So the foreign direct investment, the movement of capital flows. So that's, I don't know, an American firm building a company in Canada, for example. We see that there is still a pretty big positive trend for most of the countries, right? And of course, you see some macroeconomic shocks there, but you generally tend to see that there is a pretty stable pattern in there. And finally, we're going to think about migration. And when we think about migration, we see the increase in kind of very gentle increase in migration in US and in Germany, a pretty big uptick after the Syrian displacement and Afghanistan. So as defined in economics, we don't really see the big move away from the globalization, right? Economically, we still see that the nations are interconnected. We do see, however, that the sentiment about globalization is definitely shifting. So why is that, right? And in order for us to answer that question, I want to talk about how did we get here, right? How did we get to this kind of hyper-globalized world since 1990s, 2000s, maybe 1980s, right? So first thing first, what we have is we have a really, really big decrease in costs, right? We have the introduction of containerization, and we have introduction of the first commercial container in 1956, right? by Malcolm McLean. So now we can move a lot of goods at the same time, and it's very easy, and it becomes much cheaper. But we also see much freer trade, right? So the tariffs here I want to show you, right? This is the average tariff. And if you look at the graph, what you will see is that the average tariff has been declining since about 1940s, right? It has been going down in comparison to the previous century. So we do see freer trade. So we do see that people are trading more with each other. We do see more interconnection. However, so essentially, right, we have this idea that tariffs are going down, the world is more interconnected. Starting with Adam Smith, starting with David Ricardo, talking about the bonuses of free trade, globalization, has been great. So why do we have to keep telling people that it's great for them, right? That's kind of the question. And the question, I think, is very well answered by Joseph Stiglitz in his big body of work on globalization. And he talks about the fact that globalization basically has been mismanaged, right? The idea of globalization and theoretical, right? Globalization is based on comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the idea that we all have our own skill set, and I can do something better than you. I don't have to be best at everything, but as long as I can do something better than you and you can do something better than me, right, there is basis for trade. So essentially, we are basing it on the comparative advantage. And the idea that that comparative advantage can help us lower global prices, it gives firms access to more markets, it gives rise to economies of scale, it gives rise to increased wages, right, and standard of living. So in theory, that's great. The problem is, right, with globalization, is that the distributive effects of those gains were not well emphasized, were not as much discussed, right? Who came up with the rules on which the globalization is based? A lot of it comes back from the Bretton Woods system, right? And Bretton Woods system is the product of the post-war period, which is very different from the world that we live in today. The Bretton Woods system creates, I'm sure all of you know, right, but I just want to emphasize, Bretton Woods system essentially is the idea that US dollar is going to be pegged to the dollar, and all of the other currencies are going to be pegged to the US dollar. So this gives rise to the US hegemony, the financial hegemony, monetary hegemony, right? And kind of creates this idea that this Bretton Woods system that is conceived in 1944 and creates a lot of rules that govern the modern world, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade that now is the World Trade Organization, right, was conceived by large nations, by nations that have already had pretty established infrastructure for production, that have basically very interesting ways of writing those rules, right? And it's no doubt that those rules benefit them. And this is kind of the idea that we are coming back to, right? That the gains from globalization are concentrated very unevenly, mostly among the big multinational corporations. Multinational corporations benefited greatly from globalization. And that is because foreign markets are open to them now, right? So, you know, all of those firms can now produce much more. They also can put the pressure on the local labor markets and threaten relocation of production, right? Because now I can find cheaper labor elsewhere. I can exploit workers elsewhere. And taxation. Taxation is another big thing that was mismanaged during the globalization round, right? So all of these ideas are basically leading us to the fact that even though globalization produced a lot of gains, those gains were concentrated among very few economic agents, and fewer people, right, and agents got to enjoy that. And so we kind of have this feeling that globalization is not really that great for me, right? And in the US, it's felt pretty strongly. And of course, a lot of it is not just the function of globalization, but the function of how US markets and systems are set up. But what I want to show you here, right, is, and I'm sure that you've seen this graph in one form or the other, but what I'm showing you here is the productivity versus compensation, right? So we know that there is the productivity versus compensation gap. So what I want you to first pinpoint is the red, right? The red line represents the workers' productivity. And we see that the workers' productivity has been growing steadily. A lot of it is because we have improvements in technology. A lot of it is because we have much more higher skilled worker these days. But what we also see is that the compensation is not really commensurate with the productivity, right? And it kind of departs starting in around 1970s, around that recession of 1973 after the oil crisis, right? But what I also want to show, right, is we have to be mindful as economists always that standard of living, we can't just compare $18 in the past to $18 today, right? We have to adjust them for inflation. And that's basically what this graph is doing. So blue is looking at hourly compensation consumer price index. So that's the goods that you and I buy. The green one is we are adjusting for the GDP deflator. So it's mostly the production price index. And we also look at the purple line, which is the production price index. In all of them, right, we do see the disparity between productivity and compensation. What I also want to show is kind of the income inequality and wealth inequality, right, that permeates in the US. So we see that the aggregate income that is attributed to the middle income households, right, is going down while the upper income is going up, and the low income households are kind of stagnating. And similarly, we're looking at wealth, right? We're separating wealth from income because wealth includes assets minus the liabilities. But wealth, we are seeing a very similar pattern, right? Upper income is becoming wealthier, middle income families are becoming poorer, and lower income is kind of stagnating. So it's pretty reasonable for people to be upset, right? Especially when the narrative that we see a lot from the politicians and we see from the media is that the China shock 2001, when China joined the WTO, right, is the kind of root of all evil. And of course, I want to kind of right away say that it's not, right? But it is how it's pitched. And so when Trump comes in, he kind of comes into this world, right? And he also capitalizes on our misunderstanding of trade balances. So immediately we say, well, you know, we have such a huge trade deficit with China, right? It's really, really horrible. What are we going to do about it? So we have to remember two things. One, trade deficit can be misleading. And let me give you two examples. First, I'm going to go to 2013, right? It's because where I'm taking this example from. iPhone 5, right? It costs about $227 to produce, right? About $8 of that is contributed by the Chinese supply chain, by the Chinese part of supply chain. But when that iPhone enters the US, at the customs, it is registered as the full sum coming from the US, right? So essentially, if we're looking at the value added approach rather than just looking at the final good, we're going to see a very different picture. We're going to see additional trade balances coming in from other countries because other countries also participated in creation of this product. Similarly, when you look at a production of Boeing, right? And I'm sorry, there are a lot of little letters and countries in parentheses, but all I want to show you here is that while the final production of a Boeing plane goes towards the US exports, there are a lot of other countries involved in production of it, right? So if we're looking at trade deficit and we're looking at the standard approach, we are going to see pretty big final good sways. So that is not to say that we need to abandon the trade balance completely, right? We're just saying that we need to understand what we're capturing. Another thing I want to mention, right? When we talk about trade balance, we have to remember that import goods, right? The goods that are entering the country, we have to pay for them somehow. Export goods, we have to get paid for them somehow. So if we have a big imbalance, so we have imports greater than exports, that means we are borrowing in order to buy foreign stuff, right? All right, so here is where it gets interesting. So when we are importing, when we are exporting things to other countries usually have to pay for our goods, for the US goods, in dollars. That means that they have to buy dollars. That means that the exchange rate of the dollar is going to go up, right? The dollar is going to become more powerful. So that means that exports are now even less interesting. The US imports become less interesting to the other countries. So that more powerful dollar becomes kind of a detriment to this trade balance, right? So once again, two big things. One is the offshoring and outsourcing contributes to this kind of sway of trade balance, as well as remembering that we have to pay for imports and exports somehow, right? And a lot of the borrowing is going to affect the exchange rates, and those exchange rates are going to affect the exports and imports again. All right, so, sorry, I have to get back. All right, so then what we know right now, right? Globalization is still happening. People don't really like globalization. So does it mean that what currently governments are doing with reverting to more economic nationalism is a good idea? Well, once again, let's look at it from an economist's point of view, right? We're going to talk about tariffs. And what I'm going to show you here is not all Santa suits are created equal. Some of you might know this show, some of you might not know this show, right? This is Phoebe Buffay from the show Friends. The reason why I'm showing you this picture is look at what she's wearing, right? She's wearing this lovely red pants with kind of the white, whatever, fur around it, right? Very similar that we've seen about a month ago during the Christmas time. So the reason why I'm showing you this is because when Santa suits are entering the US, Santa suits actually are tariffed under two different codes. One of them, lower quality, are going to be festive articles. And one of them, nicer quality, are going to be tariffed as clothing, right? Clothing has a higher tariff than the festive articles. So the question is, who would wear a Santa suit unironically, right, on a regular as a clothing item? Unless you're Phoebe Buffay, you probably wouldn't, right? She bought it because it really felt good because she used it as maternity clothing, right? But the reason why I'm showing this is to show how complicated tariffs can be, right? And how little information we have about tariffs and how they work. So what I want to do today is kind of talk about tariffs and the evidence that we have from the previous round to kind of know what's going to happen in the future. So tariffs, first and foremost, just the tax on imports, right? When the tariff is imposed, it's going to do two things. First, it is going to raise the domestic prices. And second, it's going to force the exporter in the other country to accept a lower price, right? This is what we mean when we say that the tariff is absorbed by the foreign nation. It doesn't mean that Chinese firms who now have to pay tariff write a check to the US government. All that means is they are now going to lower the price that they are willing to accept for their exports, right? So how much gets absorbed is the question that we have to answer, because the question how much gets absorbed is going to get into our price indices, right? And price indices is basically just us talking about what are prices doing? Are they growing? Are they falling? If they're growing, it's inflation. Median voter doesn't like that, right? So what does that depend on? Well, that depends on elasticity. And elasticity is a favorite concept of all economists, right? Don't have to feed economists bread, just let them talk about elasticity, right? And you got yourself a mighty good time. Elasticity, all we are thinking about is when price changes, by how much does our quantity demanded or quantity supplied change? So essentially, if the price changes, how do our buying patterns respond? Do they respond a lot or a little? And that elasticity is going to determine who bears more of the tax or the tariff burden, right? If I'm more elastic, it means I'm have more substitutes. Elasticity is all about substitutability. And first thing that's most important to remember, right? Is it a necessity item? Is it a luxury item? If it's a necessity, I probably will have to buy it no matter what, and I have fewer substitutes, right? But a lot of factors go into that. Am I willing to wait? Am I willing to do my research? Am I willing to go to TJ Maxx and Goodwill, right, and looking for it? I will be able to do that if I'm looking for, I don't know, a set of bowls, but if I'm looking for, I don't know, my insulin pen, probably not a good idea, right? Don't buy your insulin pens from TJ Maxx. You know, all right, good advice, right? So essentially, whoever is less elastic is going to end up paying more of that tariff. So what do we know about tariffs and how they're going to affect the US economy? So Trump gave us, the gift, right, of imposing tariffs in 2018. And the reason why I say that he gave us this gift is because it gave us this ability to understand how it's going to affect our prices. So in order for us to remember what's going on, right, I will show you that under Trump's presidency, the first one, we had a bunch of tariffs go into effect. Tariffs on washing machines, on aluminum, and finally, he started imposing a bunch of tariffs on Chinese goods, right? So when the Chinese goods are kicking in, this is the average tariff rate growth. So you see that it really is going up because of these tariffs, especially the tariff on China. So what do we know? Well, we know that essentially, and I'm looking at the research by Cavallo and co-authors, and they looked at how did these tariffs affect the tariff pass-through rates. So basically, who is paying this tariff? And when looking at a 20% tariff, only 1% of that was absorbed by the foreign exporters, and 19% was absorbed by the US importers, right? So the US importers end up paying most of that tariff. Well, in one way it's encouraging, right? Because we know that firms basically are absorbing that impact and they're shielding our consumers, because the retail prices from these tariffs grew only by about less than 1% for the affected goods, right? So we can say, yeah, that's great. How did the firms do it? Well, they stockpiled the goods in advance, right? Because they kind of knew that the tariffs were coming. Maybe they are ordering less now, they're buying fewer goods from the US, from China. They are diversifying their supply chains, right? Maybe now they're going to be purchasing more from Vietnam or other countries. But the thing is, it's not really a sustainable strategy in the long run. Some firms will make it, but some firms will not, right? It's a dynamic system. But overall, we see that from the first round of Trump's tariffs, we definitely see that American firms are losers of this game. So what else do we know? We know that tariffs are very interesting, right? Because a lot of the times we know that tariffs are not a good idea because they create deadweight loss, and deadweight loss essentially the losses to welfare that wouldn't exist otherwise if we had a self-regulating market, right? Governments like tariffs for two reasons. Smaller nations like tariffs because it allows them to collect government revenue at a port of entry, right? A lot of small countries deal with issues with tax evasion, so having a tariff, collecting it at a port is a very easy way of getting those dollars, right? Or whatever currency you're using. But on the other hand, tariffs always lead to retaliation, right? If I'm imposing a tariff on China, China, of course, is going to impose a tariff on the US firms. And that's exactly what happened. And when Chinese firms, when Chinese government retaliated with the tariff of its own, you know who absorbed most of that cost of the tariff? It was, once again, US exporters. Why is that? Once again, we go back to the issue of elasticity, because the stuff that American exporters mostly export to China are things that are non-differentiated goods, right? So a lot of substitutes, agricultural products. And the things that US imports from the US are differentiated products, right? So the way the system is set up, it's already favoring the Chinese structure more, just because of how much differentiated stuff they're exporting. All right, so we know that the government collects about 15.6 billion in tariff revenue in 2018, right? So from these tariffs on the screen. How does this compare? Well, we have to remember there's still deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is estimated at about $8.2 billion, because we know that some firms still will lose, close, have to exit the market. All right. So another thing, right, that's, I think, kind of important to keep in mind, the new tariffs that are coming, and we know that right now they're just proposed, right? It's a 60% tariffs on imports from China, 10 to 25% tariffs on imports from other countries. So magnitude-wise, we can't make any predictions, but what I want to always remember, right, is that US consumption, about 11% of it comes from imported goods. And so here you see, right, the 10.7, 10.3%. So that's the total share of imported goods from in the total consumption basket. And most of them, once again, are coming from China, right? So if we see those pretty big increases, what's going to happen to the prices? We don't know. Are the firms going to continue to be able to absorb that shock? We don't know. All right. And all right. It's important also to remember that it wasn't just Trump, right, that kind of embraced this new economic nationalism. Biden's administration continued, basically. Biden's administration maintained most of the tax tariffs that were imposed by the Trump administration. They went even further. In spring 2024, Biden's administration imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, right? And that's a really, really big tariff. And the reason for that, of course, is the infant industry protection argument, right? To give time really for the US vehicles to bloom. And, you know, it's great, but it's consumers who are going to be put at a disadvantage, right? And consumers are really looking at inflation, is what we've learned from the past election. Another thing that Trump's administration kind of started and Biden's administration is continuing is, you know, kind of the disregard for the rules and blocking of the working of the World Trade Organization, right? World Trade Organization is there to promote freer trade and kind of reduce the tariffs. But US has been blocking the appointments of the appellate body members, right? What does it mean? Well, it means that WTO has a dispute body, right? So if someone imposes a tariff on me and I don't like it, I can go there and I say, hey, they are doing it unjustifiably because this, that, and the other. They also have an appellate body where I can appeal and say, well, I don't really like this, right? And the thing is, right now, we don't have any way to appeal any of these issues because the US has been blocking appointments since 2020, right? And that's not a great way, although I do think it kind of speaks a little bit to the hypocrisy hypothesis, right, from the reading. All right. I kind of wanted to go into the prisoner's dilemma and why WTO exists in the first place, but I think I'm gonna kind of skip that, right? All right, so I want to wrap up with kind of thinking about what is the US place in the global order, given that it's kind of pretty actively trying to pull out of all of these globalized networks that it helped put together, right? Well, first and foremost, even though US is a really, really like the first global power, right? China has been growing pretty steadily. China has been diversifying its production. I'm a child of the 1990s, right? And the biggest joy in my life was going, and I grew up in Russia, so the biggest joy in my life was going to this, we called it Chinese market, right? Where we had a lot of Chinese vendors, and they would just sell you anything you wanted, right? You can find a lot of it. And a lot of it was really, really bad quality, right? And it broke really fast, but we loved it. And what things are produced by Chinese economy now? It's really high value added things. It's very technologically advanced things. So Chinese economy is, kind of an advantage of the Trump's tariffs, right? Because of how it diversified what it produces and what it exports. But at the same time, we have some research that says that when US and China have a trade war, other countries benefit because trade wars create trade diversion, which means they redirect trade flows from one country to another. They also have trade creation, right? Basically, other countries say, well, seems like those two guys are having a moment, right? So maybe we can have like a trade agreement. Another thing that I'm going to say, and I think people very frequently worry about it and they're like, oh my God, US is going to lose its place in the global order. And of course, I don't know all the answers, but what I want to show you here is the central bank reserves in 2022, right? What does it mean? It means all central banks in all countries hold reserves. And they do it in order to be able to pay for, whatever economic events they have to deal with. But you will see here that majority of those reserves are held in US dollars, followed by euros, which is still a very, very small share in comparison to the US. So I don't think it's time to worry about, US losing its place in the global order yet, right? At least in terms of monetary hegemony, as long as the United States doesn't default on its obligations, I think it's pretty safe for now. And finally, some people speculate, right? Some researchers speculate that Trump is using the promise of tariffs more as a negotiation tactic in order to be able to negotiate with the firms, right? And say, well, I will shield you from this tariff if you do this, that, and the other for me. And of course, we don't know if that's true, but that could be one of the things. But the final thing I want to leave you all with, right? And when we all struggle with US dominance in the world, how important is it where the solar panels were produced versus how important is it that a lot of people switch to solar panels because we're facing like a climate change crisis, right? So yeah, this is where I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Anna. I've got a mic. Derek Olson has a mic. And since I have a mic, I'm going to ask the first question. I'm assuming that other people are going to have questions like Scott. So I'm going to pull a couple questions out of the Great Decisions book. I think that it's often hard for us sort of armchair economics observers to understand what all these phrases mean. And, there's post-neoliberal, there's neoliberal. So how are post-neoliberal economic ideas different from neoliberal economic ideas? And are post-neoliberal economic ideas compatible with our leadership of a liberal international order going forward?
Oh my God. You're giving me a curveball right away. So when we're thinking about neoliberalism, right, from an economist perspective, what we're thinking about is kind of tendency towards globalization, tendency to more open markets, tendency towards more cooperation. Post-neoliberal, I think, combines the ideas of the neoliberalism, right? So this idea of more open markets with maybe with a little bit more protectionism aspect of it, right? So we're saying that we are looking more at managed trade rather than free trade, right? So when we're saying we're going to remove all trade barriers, we're saying, no, we're going to keep some trade barriers, but we're going to remove a lot of them. I think, can you repeat the second part of your question, please? Sorry.
Yes. Are post-neoliberal economic policies compatible with U.S. leadership of the liberal international order?
See, I think that US kind of is self-appointed leader, right? And I do think the US right now is kind of bending the rules that it wrote a little bit for the global order. So whether it's compatible or not, I'm not so sure. I do think that it kind of goes back to the idea of the mismanaged globalization, right? Who wrote the rules? Who do the rules benefit? And can we actually get the trade gains to be shared with those who lost from trade and those who lost from globalization? So basically sacrificing a little bit more of the welfare gain in favor of a little bit less inequality. I think that would be my answer.
Thank you for your remarks. I very appreciate them. Forgive me, in the absence of the cliff notes that Tim was using, I'm going to ask a much less sophisticated question. I'm just wondering, one, if you could speak to any noticeable employment effects with
Yes.
regard to the Trump tariffs, both with regard to increased investment in manufacturing here and/or loss of job opportunities because of retaliatory tariffs. And then the other million-dollar question, but speak to it as much or as little as you could. Could you just speak to the impact of trade and services and how that mitigates some of your discussion? The example you used of the Apple iPhone, $8 from China. So there's another 215 that's going to Apple shareholders or somewhere else. But whatever you could speak to that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. These are really, really good questions. And I was going to talk about the jobs and then I completely skipped it. So that's very nice. Thank you for bringing me back to it. So essentially, the reason why governments like tariffs, right, is because when a tariff is imposed, it gives the domestic industry the shielding from the foreign competition. And what it does, and in the US, it has for a long time been the steel industry, right, having the steel tariffs. Essentially, it is going to generate jobs in the steel industry, but it is also going to destroy jobs in industries that rely on steel, right? So who buys steel? It's construction, it's manufacturing, it's, if you are Dom Toretto, right, from Fast and Furious, you're buying steel, but probably very few of us are. But essentially, all of the jobs that use steel as an input are going to be on the line. And we have several studies that estimated about 170 to 300 jobs were lost after the first round of 2018 tariffs, right? So that's a really, really big change. And the ironic thing is that US manufacturing jobs were actually on the rise before Trump took over, because after 2008 crisis, there was a really big auto industry bailout by the Obama administration, right? There was a big stimulus check, so that manufacturing jobs were on the rise. So when Trump came in, imposed tariffs, about 300,000, right? 150 to 300,000 jobs were lost. So that's a pretty big, that's like half population of the city where I grew up in. And finally, trade and services. That's a very, very good question, right? In the US, manufacturing sector is now becoming less and less prevalent, and it is shifting more towards services. So service trade definitely is growing, and it is helping to close the gap between the deficits, in the deficit, right, between the imports and exports with China especially. But the trade and services is still a growing sector, so it's not close yet to closing that gap.
My question is somewhat different, but I was trying to start out, but it's not working. Yeah, I was trying to start talking about the problems that with compensation, with income distribution effects of foreign trade. And now we're in a situation where 13% of the country is employed in manufacturing. And at the beginning of May, those jobs are coming back until we can have a lot of labor. And the services are mostly confined to, upper income kind of services are largely confined to upper income type of services, financial services, insurance, things like that. So are there really many things that can be done in the restructuring of trade that will have a noticeable impact on the income distribution effects that we're now seeing? And you might talk about that also in terms of the importance of non-tariff barriers. But or are we just, are those problems caused by a transition from an industrial to a technology economy, and that, foreign trade issues ultimately are not going to have that big effect on it? Could you talk about that whole issue, please?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we think about basically the idea, right, are we going to bring jobs back? And if we're going to bring jobs back, what kind of jobs are they going to be, right? Because Trump is promising that he's going to bring all the jobs back, right? From all the jobs are going to be in the US, right? No other country is going to have a job, only we're going to have jobs. And the problem with that rhetoric is the way that currently the system is set up, right, with the global value supply chains. For one country to rebuild the manufacturing, right, and just basically say we're only going to produce this domestically is a Herculean task. It is very, very expensive. It's probably going to be impossible, right? In terms of services, once again, right, it's such an interesting period of transition. We do see that the service sector is growing, especially post-pandemic. But is it generating a lot of jobs? Yeah, I think relative to manufacturing, absolutely. But in terms of, right, what kind of other jobs can be created, and in terms of whether we should lean into this more economic nationalism versus globalization. Once again, I think the way currently the system is set up, it's going to be very difficult to do. And I do think that it's mostly the question of how do we want to manage globalization from now on, right? And as you brought up the tariff barriers with non-tariff barriers, post globalization, they definitely have seen a rise, right? What is a non-tariff barrier? It's basically anything that can be an impediment to trade, but doesn't involve percentages, right? And say you have to pay us to for this good. In terms of non-tariff trade barriers, I think a lot of it is very interesting. A lot of it is very political. Russia is one of the countries, right? My motherland gives us a lot of joy in the economics field, a lot of reasons for research. But essentially, non-tariff barriers are more difficult to prove, right? They are more difficult to dispute within the World Trade Organization, and they come in so many shapes and sizes. So when I say a non-tariff trade barrier, you can think about things like how much time does a good spend at the customs, right? How much time does it spend going through the inspection? You can think about things like phytosanitary controls, right? EU has blocked US beef for the longest time, US dairy products, because of the hormones, right, that US uses in the production of these goods. So essentially, I think that in this current climate, if we don't embrace tariffs, countries are more likely to then go and embrace non-tariff trade barriers to try to kind of create more of the economic welfare for their own constituents.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. This has been really helpful. My question is, when Nixon pegged the US dollar to oil in 1971, was that a betrayal of the Bretton Woods system? And does that compromise global economic security for the US, especially as we start to try to think about how the world transitions off of fossil fuels to more sustainable energy? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I'm going to kind of preface, right, with saying that the national security is not really my area of expertise. So I can talk to the economic effects, but like the national security, I'm not an expert in that. So what I will say, right, is that Bretton Woods itself was not a very sustainable system with how it was set up, right? And with the current way the US performs its monetary policy, because essentially when you peg the US dollar to gold, what it means is that you have to maintain a certain amount of gold in order to justify the amount of money you have, right? And in 1950s, 1960s, US spent a lot because there were quite a few wars, right? US was fighting communism all over the world. And so when pegging the US dollar to oil, I don't think it's a betrayal, unless you're also viewing him taking off the world off of Bretton Woods system, right, by his unilateral decision, as a betrayal as well. Does that make sense?
So we've got one more question here, and this is a question from one of our online viewers who happens to be Ron Witzak, who is our dear partner here at Portland State University, who makes this series possible. And Ron would like to ask, with Trump's talk of taking back the Panama Canal, have you given any thought to the what, if any, that action might have on the global economy?
Well, let's think about it, right? Because I always like to think about in terms of kind of not historic parallels, but at least similar control groups. So to me, right, taking over the Panama Canal is similar to the idea of like a foreign invasion, right? And a foreign, like how might we treat a country that is invading another country, that is taking over what maybe it shouldn't be taking over, if you catch my drift, right? So the impacts usually, right, what leverages do we have to oppose that, which is, you know, international sanctions. But the thing is, when it comes to sanctions and when it comes to the US is the biggest center of sanctions, usually, right? US really likes economic sanctions. US uses them very liberally, right? In a sense that it does it a lot. So if US pursues the taking over of the Panama Canal, right, I think the global community probably will go and reach for the same tools that US has been reaching, right? And it will reach for economic sanctions. And economic sanctions imposed on the US probably can withstand the sanctions pressure. But at the same time, I think it's going to be very difficult for other countries to maintain the sanctions on the US just because so much is tied into it. So yeah, I really don't have like a very straightforward answer, right? Like I don't have a crystal ball, but yeah, that's kind of my honest answer.
Great. So we are at time. How about a big hand?
Thank you so much.
As in previous years, we will be posting these to the YouTube a week or so after the event. These are live streamed. So if for some reason you can't make it up to PSU during the series, you can always watch it from the comfort of your home or car or bathtub. And join us next week for International Climate Cooperation in an Era of Geopolitical Turmoil with Jillian Gregg and Greg Walker from Oregon State University. They have both been very involved with global climate reports, and one of them has been at the last 15 COP meetings. So they're going to bring some great perspective on a very vital issue. Thank you for being here. Be safe, be well, and we will hopefully see you next week.